Ethan was taking his usual morning walk when he felt a light tug at his side. At first, he thought it was a passing breeze or perhaps a stray branch, but then he noticed a small figure darting away, weaving between pedestrians with surprising speed. Instinctively, he checked his pockets. His wallet was gone. "Hey!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed up in the city's morning hum. He caught a glimpse of the thief, just a child, really barely older than 10, with a thin frame and a swift, practiced agility. She moved through the crowd like she belonged to it, her small figure blending into the bustle of early risers, vendors setting up their stands, and tourists oblivious to the commotion. For a moment, he stood still, stunned. Then something compelled him to follow her. He wove through the crowd, keeping his eyes trained on the girl's head bobbing up and down, a messy braid trailing down her back. Ethan's curiosity was piqued. He could get another wallet, replace the cards and IDs, but there was something about her, a flicker of defiance or perhaps desperation, that made him want to understand her motive. Why would such a young girl be out here alone, stealing? He followed her down winding streets he rarely ventured into, where the buildings seemed older, worn down, with crumbling facades and faded paint. She turned a corner sharply, vanishing down an alley. He hesitated. This wasn't his part of town. The walls seemed to close in, and a faint smell of mildew clung to the air. But he pressed on, curiosity and a strange sense of responsibility driving him forward. At the end of the alley, she ducked into a rundown shelter. The paint was peeling off its wooden door, and one of the windows was cracked, covered with a makeshift patch of cardboard. From the look of it, it was a place most people tried to avoid. Through a crack in the door, Ethan watched as the girl handed the wallet off to a woman in a nun's habit. The nun looked at the wallet, then at the girl, who was breathing heavily, trying to catch her breath. "Amelia," the nun said, her voice low but clear. "What did we agree on? We don't take things that aren't ours." Amelia bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor. "But we needed it for the kids. You said we didn't have enough for breakfast." The nun sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I know, but this isn't the way." Ethan felt an inexplicable tug at his heart. Ethan lingered in the shadows, torn between walking away and stepping inside. Something in him refused to leave. He wanted his wallet back, but more than that, he was intrigued by this strange situation. The girl, Amelia, and the nun who seemed to be scolding her with a mix of authority and tenderness. Slowly, he pushed the door open, his footsteps echoing faintly in the worn, empty hall of the shelter. Inside, the smell was a mix of old wood, dust, and something faintly sweet, maybe from a bakery nearby. A few children, even younger than Amelia, were scattered around the room, some playing quietly with battered toys while others colored on sheets of crumpled paper. They looked up as he entered, eyes wide, freezing in place as if a stranger stepping into their world was a rare and shocking event. Amelia, who had her back turned, didn't see him right away, but the nun did. She stood up straight, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed him. Amelia turned, her face turning pale when she recognized him. Her hand flew to her pocket, instinctively hiding it, even though she knew it wouldn't matter. Can I help you?" the nun asked, keeping her tone neutral but with a touch of caution. Ethan hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. "My wallet. I believe she has it," he said, nodding slightly toward Amelia. Amelia's eyes darted to the nun, her expression pleading. The nun, catching this, sighed and held up her hand, a wordless signal for Amelia to hand over the wallet. The girl looked down, reluctantly pulling it out and stepping forward to place it in Ethan's hand. "I'm sorry," Amelia mumbled, her voice barely audible. Ethan took the wallet, but didn't immediately open it. He glanced down at her, noticing the way her fingers fidgeted and how her eyes never quite met his. He expected to feel a rush of anger or annoyance, but instead, there was only a dull curiosity. Something was off here, and it wasn't just the girl's theft. "Are you all alone here?" he asked, looking from Amelia to the nun, who stood silently, watching him with a guarded expression. The nun's face softened, and she nodded. "My name is Sister Margaret. I run this shelter," she said simply. We take in children in need. And sometimes, she added, with a pointed glance at Amelia, they make mistakes. Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange tug of empathy. He nodded slowly, slipping the wallet into his coat pocket. I understand. I won't press charges or anything. But why? I mean, he struggled to put it into words. Why are they here? Alone, I mean. Sister Margaret looked him over, perhaps weighing how much to tell him, or if he was trustworthy. After a pause, she gestured to a few worn chairs nearby. It's a long story, but you seem to care about what brought you here, so please sit. Ethan took a seat across from her, his attention now fully drawn into this unexpected encounter. Amelia shuffled away, sitting with the other children but keeping her gaze fixed on him. He felt her watching him intently, as if trying to read him, perhaps wondering if he would really let her off the hook. Sister Margaret began, her voice low. Most of these kids have no one. Their parents, well, they have difficult lives, and sometimes that means they end up here, where they have food and safety, at least for the night. Amelia, she said, glancing toward the girl, has been with us the longest. She's seen a lot for someone her age. Ethan looked over at Amelia, who seemed suddenly fascinated by the torn carpet beneath her feet. He wanted to ask questions, but it felt wrong to pry. And you? Why are you here? He asked, looking back at Sister Margaret. A hint of a smile flickered across her face. I'm here because I'm needed, she said simply. These children are all alone without someone to look after them. I've seen too many of them disappear into the streets, into dangerous situations, or into the hands of people who'd exploit them. Amelia is a bit of a fighter, you might say. She does what she thinks is necessary to help. Amelia shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushed. I just wanted to help, she mumbled, almost defensively. We didn't have enough for breakfast. Sister Margaret said we'd have to skip it. Ethan felt a pang of something he hadn't expected. Guilt, maybe, or some lingering sense of responsibility for these kids he'd only just met. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. Well, maybe there's a way I can help, he said, the words surprising even himself. Not just with money or anything, but I don't know. Sister Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Why would you want to help us, Mr. Ethan? Just Ethan, he replied. And I'm not sure, but maybe because I feel like I'm here for a reason. Sister Margaret regarded him thoughtfully, the hint of a smile softening her otherwise guarded expression. Well, Ethan, you're welcome to stay for a little while. Maybe talk to the children. Sometimes, that's the best help you can give. Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of purpose that he hadn't anticipated when he first started following Amelia. Ethan shifted in the worn chair, unsure of what he'd just agreed to. The room buzzed faintly with murmurs from the children, who'd resumed their quiet games and drawings. But Amelia remained still, her gaze glued to him as if she were trying to size him up, figure out why he was here. As he looked around, Ethan's attention landed on something that seemed oddly out of place. On a nearby table, a delicate bracelet shimmered under the dim light, catching his eye. It looked old but was well cared for, its silver chain glinting faintly, with a small, heart-shaped charm that seemed familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. Before he could think much of it, Sister Margaret noticed his interest. Ah, she said, following his gaze. That's Amelia's. It's one of the few things she has from before. Ethan frowned, feeling an inexplicable pull. There was something about that bracelet. Before? He asked, half to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and looked at the nun, who nodded solemnly. Yes, Amelia was left here when she was just a toddler. Whoever brought her left that bracelet with a note, but no name. I kept it for her until she was old enough to take care of it herself. She never lets it out of her sight, Sister Margaret explained, a quiet sadness in her voice. It's the only connection she has to her past. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and Ethan felt a surge of memories flood back, uninvited and unrelenting. His mind drifted to his own sister, Emily, who had vanished from his life in a way that had left scars he'd long tried to ignore. She had disappeared years ago, when she was about Amelia's age now, leaving only a single item behind. a bracelet nearly identical to the one on the table. He shook his head slightly, trying to pull himself back to the present. The idea seemed too impossible, too far-fetched. Yet there it was, staring back at him with a quiet insistence. He leaned forward, looking at Sister Margaret with a seriousness she hadn't seen in him before. That bracelet? He hesitated, wondering if he was crazy for even asking. Does she have any other family? Sister Margaret's expression softened. Not that we know of, she said quietly. When she was found, there was no information on where she'd come from. We've tried to trace her back to any relatives, but, she shrugged helplessly. There's been nothing. Ethan leaned back, his mind whirling with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He wanted to dismiss the notion that this girl, Amelia, could somehow be connected to his missing sister, but the bracelet felt like more than a coincidence. His hand drifted unconsciously to his pocket, feeling the edges of his wallet as he steadied himself. Amelia watched him closely, and he could sense the suspicion in her eyes. She shifted slightly, as if preparing to leave, a restless energy radiating from her small frame. She looked like she was about to speak, maybe even confront him, but she seemed to think better of it, casting a furtive glance at Sister Margaret instead. Amelia, Ethan said softly, hoping to draw her in without scaring her off. Do you remember anything? Anything from before you came here? Amelia frowned, her brows knitting together as she considered his question. She glanced at the bracelet, her fingers instinctively reaching up to touch her wrist where it usually sat, though today she'd left it on the table, perhaps in a rare moment of trust or distraction. I don't remember much, she admitted finally, her voice soft and distant. Just, sometimes I feel like I remember a face. A woman. But it's all blurry, like when you're trying to remember a dream after you wake up. And sometimes I think I'm just making it all up. Ethan swallowed, feeling his heart beat harder in his chest. There was so much he wanted to say, so many questions he wanted to ask, but he knew pushing her too hard might only drive her further away. He took a deep breath, deciding to ease into it. It's okay not to remember everything, he said, keeping his voice gentle. Sometimes memories come back to us in pieces, little by little. Amelia studied him, her face a mix of skepticism and reluctant interest. She clearly didn't trust him yet, but there was something in his tone that seemed to soften her gaze just a little. Why do you care? She asked bluntly, folding her arms in front of her. Her tone held a mixture of suspicion and defiance, as if she'd learned the hard way that most adults weren't genuinely interested in her life. Ethan felt a twinge of guilt. He hadn't exactly earned her trust, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd found her for a reason. I'm not sure, he admitted, meeting her gaze evenly. Maybe because I know what it's like to lose someone important. Sister Margaret watched the two of them, her expression pensive, as if she too sensed that something more significant was at play. She took a breath, then gently placed her hand on Amelia's shoulder. You don't have to talk about anything if you're not comfortable, Amelia, she said, reassuring the girl. Ethan here is just curious, and I think he means well. Amelia glanced between them, her eyes filled with a hint of uncertainty. She seemed to consider her options, weighing what little she knew of this stranger against the flicker of trust in Sister Margaret's words. Finally, she nodded, though she still looked guarded. Okay, she murmured, but just for a little while. As she spoke, Ethan noticed something he hadn't seen before. A scar, faint but noticeable, tracing a thin line just under her left jawline. It struck him as odd, something that seemed out of place on a child. He made a mental note to ask Sister Margaret about it later, though he kept his curiosity in check, focusing instead on the delicate connection he was trying to establish with Amelia. A quiet tension filled the air, and the room grew still as they all settled into a tentative silence. Ethan felt as though he was on the edge of something monumental, something that could pull him deeper into the mysteries of his past than he'd ever intended to go. As the minutes passed, he watched Amelia, her expression shifting as she seemed to weigh her next words carefully, as if deciding just how much to reveal to this stranger who'd stumbled into her world. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. He stayed quiet, hoping that by simply being there, Amelia would begin to trust him enough to share more. After a while, Sister Margaret rose, excusing herself as she went to tend to a few of the younger children who had started arguing over a set of worn-out crayons. This left Ethan and Amelia alone in the corner of the small room, the quiet settling over them like a fragile truce. "Do you really not remember anything about your family?" he asked gently, watching her face closely. Amelia shifted uncomfortably, picking at a frayed thread on her sweater. "I told you, I don't remember much. Just pieces." She looked down, her expression guarded, as if she was used to hiding her feelings and wasn't about to let them slip out for a stranger. Ethan took a deep breath, realizing that if he wanted her to open up, he would have to do the same. "I had a sister once," he began, his voice soft but steady. "Her name was Emily. She disappeared when she was around your age. We never found her." He stopped, letting the words hang in the air, hoping that this small glimpse into his own pain might reach her. Amelia's eyes flickered with something, a glimmer of understanding, maybe even sympathy. She hesitated, glancing down at the bracelet on the table, her fingers tracing the heart-shaped charm as though it held the answers she was searching for. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I do remember something. Not a lot. Just a place. I think it was somewhere near the water, with a lot of trees. And there was someone. A woman." Her brows furrowed as she struggled to grasp at the faint, fleeting images. "I think she was my mom, but I can't see her face." Ethan's heart clenched. His sister had loved the water, too. They'd grown up near the coast, spending hours on the shore, collecting seashells and daring each other to wade out into the waves. He could almost picture Emily standing there, looking back at him with that mischievous grin, the wind in her hair. He cleared his throat, pushing the memory back. "It's okay if you don't remember clearly," he said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes, things come back to us when we least expect them." Amelia looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Do you think maybe that's why I'm here? Because someone forgot about me?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. "No," he replied quickly, shaking his head. "No, Amelia, you're not here because someone forgot about you. Maybe they just didn't know how to find you." She didn't say anything, but he saw her jaw tighten as she looked away, her fingers still holding tightly to the bracelet. She was quiet for a long moment before she finally broke the silence. "Sister Margaret says I was found in a park, all by myself. They tried to find my family, but no one came." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Ethan could hear the faint edge of pain buried beneath her words. "I know it's hard to believe," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "but sometimes people get lost, and it takes them a long time to find their way back." Amelia didn't answer, but he could see a flicker of hope in her eyes, quickly masked by her usual wariness. She crossed her arms over her chest, as if to guard herself from the vulnerability his words had stirred in her. Sister Margaret returned then, her expression somber as she approached. She glanced between Ethan and Amelia, as if sensing that their conversation had taken a serious turn. She took a seat next to Ethan, folding her hands in her lap. "Amelia, sweetheart," she said gently, "why don't you go help the others clean up the coloring supplies? I'll talk with Ethan for a bit." Amelia nodded slowly, casting one last, curious glance at Ethan before getting up and moving across the room. As she left, Ethan noticed her fingers trailing over the bracelet, as if she was drawing some kind of strength from its touch. Once Amelia was out of earshot, Sister Margaret turned to him, her face clouded with concern. "Ethan," she began quietly, "I can see you care about Amelia, but I should warn you, she's been hurt a lot. She's learned not to trust easily, and I don't want her to be disappointed again." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her caution. "I get that. I can't ignore this feeling. That bracelet, it's almost identical to one my sister used to wear. And Amelia, something about her reminds me of Emily." He looked down, wrestling with emotions he hadn't expected. "I know it sounds crazy." Sister Margaret studied him, her gaze both gentle and piercing. "It doesn't sound crazy. In fact, I've come across a lot of cases where children end up in shelters because they've been separated from their families. But before you start assuming anything, You should know something else about Amelia. Ethan felt a jolt of anxiety, nodding for her to continue. Sister Margaret looked down, clasping her hands as she spoke. A few years back, someone tried to take Amelia from here. It was a man, someone she didn't recognize, but he claimed to be her uncle. He had no papers, no proof, nothing. But he was insistent. We refused to let him take her, of course, and he left. But her voice trailed off, her expression darkening. I'm not sure his intentions were good. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Did he ever come back? She shook her head. No, but I never stopped worrying that he might. Since then, Amelia's been cautious. She knows what happened, though I've tried to explain it in ways she could understand without frightening her. A mixture of protectiveness and anger surged within him. Do you think he was really her uncle? Sister Margaret sighed, her gaze distant. I don't know, but something about him didn't sit right. I've kept an eye on Amelia ever since, made sure she knows she's safe here. But sometimes, I wonder if there's more to her story than we'll ever know. Ethan looked across the room, watching Amelia as she sat with the younger kids, helping them sort the crayons into a tattered box. She seemed different now, almost fragile, a side of her he hadn't noticed before. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he left now, he'd be abandoning something important, something he wasn't meant to walk away from. Sister Margaret, he said quietly, if there's any way, any chance, of finding out where Amelia came from, I want to help. She looked at him thoughtfully, her face softening. That's a kind offer, Ethan, but you should know, it won't be easy. The files we have are sparse, and no official records link her to any living family. He nodded, a determination settling over him. I understand, but I still want to try. I owe it to Emily, and maybe to Amelia too. Sister Margaret smiled gently, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Then, let's start by going through what we do know. I'll bring the files out for you to look at. As she got up and moved toward the back of the shelter, Ethan's gaze drifted back to Amelia, who glanced up just in time to meet his eyes. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. A glimmer of recognition, perhaps, or a spark of understanding. And in that fleeting look, Ethan felt a bond begin to form, fragile yet undeniable, like a thread of light in the dark. Ethan waited in silence as Sister Margaret disappeared into a small office at the back of the shelter, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The quiet murmur of the children filled the room, and he found himself watching Amelia, wondering what life might have been like for her here. She seemed so small, surrounded by those peeling walls and worn-out furniture, yet there was a strength in her, something he couldn't quite put into words but that felt familiar, like a memory just out of reach. Finally, Sister Margaret returned, holding a thin manila folder that looked barely used, its corners frayed. She held it gently, almost reverently, as she handed it to him. This is all we have on Amelia, she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. It isn't much, but maybe it's enough for a start. Ethan took the folder, his fingers brushing against the worn paper. He opened it slowly, feeling an odd mixture of anticipation and dread. Inside, there were only a few sheets, a brief intake form, some handwritten notes, and a single, faded photograph of Amelia as a toddler, wide-eyed and solemn, clutching a small stuffed animal. He studied her face, seeing traces of the girl she had grown into, and wondered how much of her story remained buried in those early years. He skimmed through the intake form first, his eyes scanning the sparse details. Found in City Park, abandoned at approximately 2 years old, it read. No identification, no known family. The rest was standard shelter procedure. A few notes about her health, an approximate date of birth, but nothing concrete. Nothing that would help him piece together who she might have been before she arrived here. Ethan felt a pang of frustration as he looked up at Sister Margaret. There's so little here, he said, his voice betraying his disappointment. Is there really nothing else? Sister Margaret shook her head, her expression apologetic. I wish I had more answers for you, Ethan, but we did all we could back then. We tried to reach out to local authorities, even posted notices in the paper, hoping someone would come forward. But no one did. She glanced over at Amelia, who was busy instructing the younger children on how to stack their crayons, her voice calm but firm. "She's never known anyone but us. And even though we've done our best, she's always known there was something missing." Ethan let out a long sigh, his eyes drifting back to the photograph. He held it up, studying Amelia's face, wondering what she'd gone through before she'd been found. The faint scar on her cheek that he'd noticed earlier now stood out more in the old photograph, an unsettling detail that only added to his unease. "Do you know how she got this scar?" he asked, gesturing to the faint line on her face. Sister Margaret nodded slowly, her expression grave. "The police said it was likely from an accident, maybe a fall or something sharp. They couldn't be sure, but it was already there when she was found. She must have had it for a while." Ethan's hand tightened around the edge of the photograph as he tried to imagine Amelia as a tiny, helpless child, alone and injured, left to fend for herself in a city park. The thought made his chest tighten with a fierce protectiveness he hadn't anticipated. As he leafed through the papers, his fingers brushed against something unexpected. A small, folded piece of paper wedged in the back of the folder, hidden beneath the intake forms. Curious, he carefully unfolded it. The paper was old, its edges frayed and yellowed with time, and written in neat but fading script was a single line: "Take care of her. She has no one else." The message was simple, but it struck him deeply. Who had left it? And why had they felt the need to give her up, yet cared enough to leave a note? It was a mystery that left him with more questions than answers, but it was also a reminder of just how vulnerable Amelia had been, and still was. Ethan looked up at Sister Margaret, his jaw set with determination. "I can't just walk away from this," he said, his voice firm. "If there's even a chance that she could be my sister's child, or that she has family somewhere, I need to find out." Sister Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression one of quiet understanding. "I can see that, Ethan. And, as much as I care about her, I think Amelia deserves to know the truth. She's a strong girl, but even she feels that missing piece." They both turned to watch Amelia, who was now carefully lining up the crayons in a rainbow pattern, oblivious to the conversation. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities, questions, and fears. He knew that uncovering the truth might lead to painful discoveries, but he couldn't let that stop him. "Not now. Where should I start?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sister Margaret placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I have a contact in social services who helped us when Amelia was brought in. She might be able to access records that we don't have here, or at least point us in the right direction." She paused, her gaze steady. "But, Ethan, I need you to promise me something." He looked at her, sensing the gravity in her words. "Of course. If this leads nowhere, if the answers are still out of reach, I need you to let it go. For Amelia's sake. She's already been through so much, and I can't let her be hurt by another dead end. Can you promise me that?" Ethan hesitated, a wave of uncertainty washing over him. He knew how much this meant to him, how desperately he wanted answers. But he also knew that she was right. Amelia's well-being came first, even if it meant leaving some questions unanswered. Finally, he nodded, his voice steady. "I promise. If this doesn't lead anywhere, I'll let it go." Satisfied, Sister Margaret nodded, her face softening. "Then I'll make the call tomorrow. But for now, maybe it's best if we keep this between us." Ethan agreed, understanding that this was a delicate situation. He knew he would need to be patient, to take things one step at a time, even if every part of him wanted to dive headfirst into finding the truth. Just then, Amelia wandered back over, eyeing the folder in Ethan's hands with a curious look. "What are you two talking about?" she asked, folding her arms and glancing between them. Sister Margaret smiled, her voice warm and gentle. "Ethan and I were just discussing some old paperwork, dear. Nothing to worry about." Amelia didn't seem convinced, but she let it go, eyeing the folder one last time before looking at Ethan. "Are you leaving now?" He shook his head, feeling a strange sense of relief that he didn't have to say goodbye just yet. "Not yet," he said softly. "I'll be around a little longer, if that's okay with you." She shrugged, though he noticed the slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Suit yourself," she mumbled, before glancing at the bracelet on the table. picking it up and slipping it back onto her wrist. As he watched her, Ethan felt a sense of purpose settle over him, deeper and more powerful than anything he'd felt in years. This was more than a quest for answers. It was a second chance, a chance to protect someone, to give them the family he hadn't been able to give his sister. He didn't know what the next steps would be, or where this path might lead him, but as he looked at Amelia, he knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing outside the shelter once again, a faint chill in the air as the sun struggled to break through a layer of gray clouds. The weight of what he was about to embark on pressed heavily on him. He had reached out to a private investigator, an old friend named Jack who specialized in finding people and uncovering secrets, even the ones that seemed best left buried. Jack was waiting for him by the entrance, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a battered leather jacket. He had a sharp, watchful look, the kind of gaze that seemed to notice every detail. When he saw Ethan, he lifted his chin in greeting, his expression a blend of curiosity and something more cautious. "Ethan," he greeted, giving a small nod. "Didn't expect to hear from you about something like this." Ethan returned the nod, though his mind was elsewhere, still on Amelia and the faint, almost imperceptible hope that had rooted itself in his heart. "Thanks for meeting me on such short notice. It's a lot to explain." Jack looked him over with a discerning eye, as if trying to read the entire story on Ethan's face. "Don't worry. I've got time. I'm here to help, whatever it is." They walked together to a small coffee shop around the corner, where Ethan laid out everything he knew so far. The bracelet, Amelia's mysterious past, and the slim but persistent hope that she might somehow be linked to Emily. Jack listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he took in each detail, his silence stretching until Ethan finally finished. "You know it's a long shot, right?" Jack asked, his voice low but not unkind. "Kids who end up in places like that, it's rare they're connected to people looking for them. Most of the time, they're forgotten." Ethan bristled at the word, the implication that Amelia was a child no one cared about. "I know it's a long shot," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But she deserves to know if there's anyone out there for her. And if there's any chance that she's family. I need to find out." Jack studied him, the hard lines of his face softening slightly. "All right, we'll start with the basics. The shelter records, the note you found, any potential links to Emily." He paused, considering. "But this might mean looking into some dark places, Ethan. These kids, sometimes they come from situations you can't just walk away from. Are you ready for that?" Ethan took a deep breath, his mind flickering back to the scar on Amelia's cheek, the strange man who'd once tried to take her, and the haunted look that occasionally appeared in her eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes." With a slight nod, Jack leaned back, pulling out a notepad and pen from his jacket pocket. He jotted down a few notes before looking up, his expression serious. "First, let's see if there's anything in the system on her. Sometimes there are records that just disappear for whatever reason, but I know a few ways to get around that. And I'll follow up with the shelter, get a list of the other kids who were taken in around the same time. You never know. Sometimes cases overlap." Ethan nodded, grateful for Jack's expertise, but acutely aware of the many dead ends they might face. Just the thought of coming up empty, of having to walk away without answers, was almost unbearable. But Jack's calm, methodical approach gave him a glimmer of reassurance. At least now he had a plan, a direction. "Thanks, Jack," he said, his voice heavy with gratitude. "I know this isn't an easy ask." Jack shrugged, slipping the notepad back into his jacket. "You know me, Ethan. I've always had a soft spot for the tough cases. Besides," he added with a faint smile, "something tells me you wouldn't be here if this wasn't important." They left the coffee shop, Jack heading toward the city's public records office while Ethan made his way back to the shelter, hoping to speak with Sister Margaret again. As he walked, he thought about everything he'd learned so far. The scar, the bracelet, and the man who had once tried to take Amelia. Pieces of a puzzle that felt tantalizingly close but frustratingly out of reach. When he arrived at the shelter, he found Sister Margaret waiting for him by the entrance, her expression both curious and concerned. She gave him a warm, though slightly strained, smile as he approached. "Good morning, Ethan," she greeted him, her tone gentle. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you back so soon." Ethan returned the smile, though his mind was racing. "I wanted to talk with you about Amelia. I've started looking into her past, with the help of a friend. I just need to know if there's anything else you remember. Anything that might help us piece things together." Sister Margaret hesitated, glancing back toward the shelter where Amelia and the other children were playing in the common room. She seemed to weigh her words carefully before finally speaking. "I don't know much more than what we discussed yesterday, but there was something odd, something I didn't mention before." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What is it?" When Amelia was first brought in, she had a small box with her. Inside were just a few items: a doll, a piece of broken jewelry, and a drawing. The drawing, though, it wasn't like something a child would make. It was rough, almost frantic, and it showed a house near the water. At the time, I thought it was just a child's imagination. But, looking back, I wonder if it meant something. Ethan's mind raced as he pictured the drawing in his head. A house near the water, just as Amelia had described in her fleeting memories. "Do you still have it?" he asked, his voice thick with anticipation. Sister Margaret nodded slowly. "I do. It's in our storage room. I didn't want to throw it away. It felt like it might be important, though Amelia's never asked about it." She motioned for him to follow her down a narrow hallway toward a small storage room at the back of the building. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood, filled with shelves of boxes and bins labeled with dates and names of children who had come and gone over the years. She rummaged through a stack of files before pulling out a small, battered box. Inside, among a few toys and trinkets, lay a crumpled sheet of paper. She handed it to Ethan carefully, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "Here it is." The drawing she came with. Ethan took the paper, smoothing out the creases, and examined it closely. The lines were thick and jagged, drawn in what looked like charcoal or a dull pencil, capturing a simple yet haunting image of a lone house by the water, surrounded by trees. Something about it felt almost familiar, stirring a strange sense of déjà vu that he couldn't quite place. As he stared at the drawing, his heart pounded with an urgency that felt almost physical. This house? He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he'd seen it before. Perhaps in one of the family photos he'd stored away after Emily had disappeared, or maybe in a memory that had faded over time. But there it was, staring back at him with an unshakable sense of recognition. Sister Margaret watched him, her expression softening as she saw the intensity in his eyes. "Does it mean something to you, Ethan?" she asked gently. "I think it might," he murmured, barely able to tear his gaze away from the drawing. "I don't know how or why, but it feels familiar. Like I've seen this place before." He looked up, his voice steadier. "If I can find this house, maybe I can find some answers." She nodded, her expression one of quiet support. "Then follow that instinct. Sometimes, memories have a way of guiding us when we least expect it." Ethan carefully folded the drawing and placed it back in the box, his mind already racing with possibilities. If this house really was connected to Amelia's past, and maybe even to his sister, then he had to find it. It was a long shot, but after everything he'd learned, he was no longer willing to let any detail slip by without chasing it down. "Thank you, Sister Margaret," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For keeping this and for everything." She smiled softly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Amelia's a special girl, Ethan, and she deserves to know where she came from. Just, please be careful. Not all answers are easy ones." He nodded, her words settling into his mind as a quiet warning. He knew that whatever he might uncover, there was a chance it would only bring more pain. But he also knew that the truth, whatever it was, couldn't remain buried forever. And for Amelia's sake, as well as his own, he was willing to face it. As he left the shelter, the drawing clutched tightly in his hand, Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew he was ready to see it through, no matter what he found at the end. Days passed, and Ethan poured all his energy into tracking down the house from Amelia's drawing. Every detail of the sketch, the lonely house, the dense line of trees, the faint outline of water, remained burned into his memory. Jack had helped him contact a few local records offices and had even managed to pull up old photos from coastal towns within driving distance. But so far, they'd found nothing. It was as if the house existed only in the realms of memory and imagination, a figment woven into Amelia's mysterious past. One evening, Jack called him with an update that offered a sliver of hope. "I think I've found something," he said, his voice crackling through the line with a hint of excitement. "I came across an old map of a coastal neighborhood outside the city. There's a house matching Amelia's drawing almost perfectly. I'd bet my next paycheck it's the place we've been looking for." Ethan felt his pulse quicken, a strange mix of dread and anticipation filling him. "Where is it?" "It's in Seabrook, an old town by the bay," Jack replied. "It's pretty isolated now, with most of the houses vacant. But from what I can see, it's the kind of place that wouldn't have changed much over the years." Without wasting a moment, Ethan grabbed his jacket and keys. They agreed to meet early the next morning, as Jack wanted to go with him, to ensure they didn't miss any crucial details. That night, sleep eluded him. His mind was a storm of questions, each more unsettling than the last. What would he find there? What if this really was the place tied to Amelia's past, and, just maybe, to Emily's? The next morning, Ethan and Jack drove out to Seabrook. The landscape shifted as they left the city, tall buildings giving way to open stretches of coastline, with the occasional weathered cottage dotting the roadside. They drove in silence, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the rhythmic crash of waves in the distance. When they finally arrived, Ethan felt a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. The small, forgotten town looked as if it had been frozen in time, untouched by modern life. Jack parked near a cluster of abandoned houses, most of them dilapidated with overgrown yards and broken windows. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decaying wood, a potent reminder of how long the place had stood empty. They got out of the car, standing side by side as they looked out over the quiet, desolate scene. "This way," Jack murmured, leading him down a narrow, winding path lined with tall grass. The path ended at the edge of a clearing, where a single house stood, its gray walls battered by years of storms and neglect. It was unmistakable, the house from the drawing. It looked exactly as Amelia had sketched it, down to the eerie way it seemed to sit alone, surrounded by dense trees and the distant glint of water. Ethan's heart pounded as they approached, his breath catching in his throat. He could almost feel the weight of his past mingling with the present, as if this house held memories that were his and yet not his. The air around them felt heavy, charged with a sense of purpose that made his skin prickle. "Let's check inside," Jack said quietly, his tone serious as he motioned toward the door. The front door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusty hinges that creaked when they pushed it open. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and dust, its once cozy walls now stripped bare. Faded wallpaper peeled from the corners, and the floorboards groaned underfoot, each step echoing through the empty rooms. They moved through the house slowly, their footsteps tentative as they scanned each room for clues. The living room held an old, faded couch and a broken lamp, remnants of a time long past. In the kitchen, a rusted kettle sat abandoned on the stove, a thin layer of grime covering the countertops. But it was the small room at the end of the hall that caught Ethan's attention. As he stepped inside, he felt an inexplicable pull, as if he'd been here before, even though he knew he hadn't. The walls were covered in faint scribbles, childish drawings of flowers, animals, and a woman's face, all scrawled in a haphazard pattern that filled nearly every inch of space. Ethan froze, his heart sinking as he studied the drawings. They were simple, rough sketches, but there was something hauntingly familiar about the woman's face repeated over and over, her smile sad and distant. It reminded him of Emily, of the way she used to smile at him, that look of quiet understanding that only siblings could share. Jack noticed his reaction, glancing between Ethan and the drawings on the wall. "You recognize her?" Ethan nodded slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I think it's my sister, Emily." He reached out, his fingers grazing one of the drawings, feeling a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. Whoever had lived here, Whoever had drawn these pictures had known Emily or someone who looked uncannily like her. They continued searching the room, and Jack noticed something odd tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the corner. He knelt down, prying it up carefully. Beneath it lay a small, weathered box. He picked it up, brushing away the dust, and handed it to Ethan, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside the box was a locket, its chain thin and tarnished. When he opened it, he found two photos. One of a woman who looked exactly like Emily and, beside her, a tiny child with wide, solemn eyes. The child wore a familiar bracelet, a heart-shaped charm dangling from her wrist, identical to the one Amelia now wore. Ethan's breath caught. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave, almost too much to process. This child in the photograph, it was Amelia, and the woman beside her, his sister Emily, smiling with a look of tenderness he hadn't seen in years. Somehow, they had been together, long after he'd thought he'd lost her. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "This is big, Ethan," he said quietly. "It means Emily was with her, that they were together before she ended up alone." Ethan's mind raced with questions. Why had Emily kept Amelia a secret? Had she been hiding from something or someone? He looked down at the locket, the photograph now burned into his memory, as if it had always been there. Whatever Emily had been involved in, it had led her here, to this lonely house by the water. A low rustling noise broke his thoughts, and both men turned, listening intently. It was faint, but distinct, the sound of footsteps outside, coming from the direction of the trees. Jack held up a hand, motioning for Ethan to stay quiet as he moved to the window. Peering out, Jack's face tightened. "There's someone out there," he murmured, his voice tense. "Could be a squatter, or someone else." Ethan's grip on the locket tightened, an instinctual protectiveness rising within him. "Whoever it is, they might know something. Let's go." They slipped out of the house, moving quietly as they edged toward the tree line. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of being watched remained, prickling at the back of Ethan's neck. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Jack motioned for Ethan to wait while he scouted ahead. Ethan crouched behind a tree, holding his breath as he scanned the shadows. After a few moments, Jack reappeared, his face grim. "It's clear. Whoever it was, they're gone now." Relief and disappointment mingled within him. Whoever had been there had left, slipping away before they could confront them. But this discovery, this strange connection between Emily and Amelia, was enough to fuel his search even further. He wouldn't stop now, not with so many questions still unanswered. As they walked back to the car, Ethan kept the locket clutched tightly in his hand, his mind churning with possibilities. The house had given him a piece of Emily's life he hadn't known existed, a secret she had taken to her grave, or so he had thought. But now, with Amelia by his side, maybe he could finally find the truth. Looking back one last time at the lonely house, he made a silent promise to his sister, wherever she was. He would find out what had happened, not just for himself, but for Amelia. And he would make sure she never felt alone again. After returning from Seabrook, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the locket from his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, her smile tinged with a sadness he hadn't understood as a boy. He saw Amelia, a small child in that faded photograph, clutching the bracelet that had led him to this journey in the first place. Ethan visited the shelter more frequently now, always finding a way to spend time with Amelia. She was growing used to his presence, though she maintained her guarded demeanor. Some days, they'd sit outside on the small concrete steps of the shelter, watching the city pass by in the distance. It was during these quiet moments that he sensed the walls around her beginning to crack, little by little. One afternoon, Ethan found Amelia sitting by herself in a corner of the shelter's small, fenced-in yard, her knees drawn up as she watched a few of the younger children playing. She looked so much like Emily in that moment, lost in her own thoughts, that it nearly broke his heart. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. She shrugged, but didn't say no, so he took a seat beside her, leaning back against the fence as they sat in comfortable silence. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked, her gaze fixed on a crack in the sidewalk. Ethan took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. I'm here because I want to get to know you, Amelia, because I think I might be able to help you find answers. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. What kind of answers? About where you came from, he replied softly. About who you are. Her eyes darkened, and she looked away quickly, hiding the brief flicker of vulnerability that crossed her face. No one's ever really wanted to know that before. Not even me. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle heavily on him. She had grown up with that emptiness, with the feeling that she was alone in the world, her past a mystery that no one had bothered to solve. He couldn't begin to imagine what that felt like, but he was determined to change it. I know it's hard to believe, he said gently, but you're not alone. You never have been. For a moment, her defenses seemed to soften, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find a reason to trust him. But then her gaze hardened again, and she turned away, folding her arms tightly over her chest. People say things like that all the time, she mumbled. And then they leave. Ethan felt a surge of frustration, not with her, but with the years of disappointment that had clearly hardened her. He wanted to tell her everything right then, to tell her about the locket, the house, the photograph, and the possibility that Emily had been her mother. But he knew he had to be careful. She'd been hurt too many times to accept such an enormous truth so easily. I understand, he replied quietly, and I don't blame you for feeling that way. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for as long as you want me to be. She didn't answer, but she didn't push him away either. They sat in silence for a while longer, the soft chatter of the children filling the air around them. Ethan watched her out of the corner of his eye, taking in the subtle ways she resembled his sister. The same way she held her hands, the thoughtful tilt of her head, even the way her eyes seemed to carry a weight beyond her years. It was as if a piece of Emily had been left behind, wrapped up in this girl who had grown up thinking she was alone. After a few more minutes, she looked up at him, her face a mix of confusion and curiosity. If you find out anything, will you tell me? Ethan nodded, his heart aching with the simplicity of her request. Of course, Amelia. You deserve to know the truth, whatever it is. A faint, reluctant smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, and for the first time, Ethan felt that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. It was a small step, but it was enough. The next day, Ethan visited Jack, who was waiting for him at a small diner downtown, stacks of papers and printouts spread across the booth table. Jack looked up as Ethan entered, nodding in greeting, his expression serious. Got a few things for you, Jack said as Ethan slid into the booth across from him. Some good news, some not so good. Ethan tensed, bracing himself. Start with the good. Jack sifted through the papers, pulling out a faded report. I dug deeper into old case files from the county records office, and I found a report that seems to confirm Emily was in Seabrook, at least for a while. It's not much, just a witness statement, but it mentions a woman matching her description and a child fitting Amelia's age at the time. They were seen near the water, close to that house. Ethan felt a swell of emotion, a bittersweet confirmation that Emily had indeed been with Amelia, that she tried to give her daughter a life, even if it was in hiding. And the not-so-good news? Jack's face grew grim as he slid a police report across the table. There was an investigation tied to that address. Apparently, a man connected to some unsavory circles was renting the house around the time Emily was there. He was involved in some shady dealings, and it's possible he was the reason she ended up there in the first place. Ethan's hands clenched around the edge of the report, his stomach churning. The idea that his sister, and by extension Amelia, had been involved in something dangerous made his blood run cold. Do they have a name? Yeah, Jack replied, his voice low. Alejandro Reyes. He has a record. Petty crimes, nothing major, but enough to suggest he wasn't the kind of person you'd want around a child. Ethan's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Alejandro, the man who had once tried to take Amelia from the shelter, claiming to be her uncle. It all made a twisted kind of sense now. Alejandro must have known something about Emily, perhaps even had a role in whatever had led to her disappearance. Do you think he could still be looking for her? Ethan asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "It's possible," Jack replied. "But if he hasn't found her by now, it's likely he's either given up or doesn't know where she ended up. Still, it's a loose end, one you'll want to be cautious of." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of this new revelation settle heavily on his shoulders. He'd found answers, yes, but they were tangled in darkness, in a past that might put Amelia in danger all over again. He knew he couldn't let her go through that, not when he was so close to finally giving her the security she deserved. "I need to tell her, Jack," he said, his voice firm. "She deserves to know the truth, or at least as much of it as she's ready for." Jack looked at him, his expression a mix of caution and respect. "Just be careful, Ethan. She's still a kid, and a lot of this, it's not easy to hear." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of Jack's words. But he also knew that honesty was the only way forward. Amelia had lived in the shadows of her own life for too long. She deserved a chance to step into the light, to understand who she was and where she came from. Later that evening, back at the shelter, he found Amelia in the small library, a quiet corner where she often went to escape. She looked up as he entered, her face unreadable, though he sensed a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "Amelia," he began gently, pulling up a chair beside her. "I have something I need to tell you." Her eyes widened slightly, and she sat up straighter, her gaze fixed on him. "What is it?" Taking a deep breath, Ethan told her everything he could, about the house in Seabrook, about the photograph, about Emily and the possibility that she might have been Amelia's mother. He kept his voice calm, steady, letting each word settle before moving on to the next, watching her face as she processed it all. By the time he finished, Amelia was silent, her gaze distant as she absorbed the gravity of his words. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, her expression a mixture of wonder, sadness, and something deeper, something that looked almost like hope. "So, she was with me?" she asked finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. My mom." Ethan nodded, his voice gentle. "Yes, Amelia. She was with you, and I think she loved you very much." Amelia's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Ethan saw her walls crumble. She looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw, "for not giving up on me." Ethan felt his own eyes sting, a wave of emotion washing over him as he reached out, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere, Amelia. Not now, not ever." In that moment, he knew he'd found the beginning of something real, a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by the unbreakable bond of shared loss and newfound hope. And he vowed silently to himself that he would protect her, no matter what the future held. The days after Ethan shared the truth with Amelia were a whirlwind of quiet transformation. Amelia was still reeling from the revelations, but something about her had changed. She seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her young shoulders. She still had questions, but the fear that had once shadowed her gaze was beginning to fade, replaced by a new spark, a tentative curiosity about a past she'd never known she had. Ethan, meanwhile, felt the impact of their bond settle into him like an anchor. He'd spent so much of his life haunted by Emily's disappearance, by the hole her absence had carved into his life. But now, with Amelia by his side, he had found a way to fill that emptiness, to make peace with his past by offering her a future. He knew their journey wasn't over. There were still answers to uncover, and a sense of danger that lingered, too close for comfort. One evening, after the other children had gone to bed, Sister Margaret pulled Ethan aside. They sat in the small, dimly lit office that served as her workspace, the hum of the shelter's old radiator filling the silence as she took a deep breath, her expression solemn. "Ethan," she began, her voice low and careful, "I wanted to talk to you about Amelia's safety. I think it's wonderful that you've found this connection with her, and I can see that you're both finding healing in it. But I have concerns about that man you mentioned, Alejandro." Ethan nodded, feeling a familiar chill crawl up his spine at the mention of Alejandro's name. Ever since Jack had uncovered his connection to Emily's past, Ethan had been wary, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that Alejandro might return. It wasn't something he had shared with Amelia. She'd already been through enough, and he couldn't bear to weigh her down with more fear. But he knew he couldn't ignore the threat, either. "I know," he replied, his tone serious. "I've been thinking about that, too. Alejandro has tried to take her once before, and if he finds out she's still here, he might try again." "I won't let that happen." Sister Margaret nodded, her eyes softening with sympathy. "I know you won't, Ethan, but I think it might be time to consider other options. She needs a stable home, a place where she can feel safe, where you can keep a close eye on her." Ethan sat back, the weight of her suggestion settling heavily on him. The thought of Amelia living with him had crossed his mind more than once, but he had hesitated, unsure if he was ready to take on that responsibility. He wanted to protect her, to offer her a home, but the idea of becoming her guardian was daunting, an uncharted territory he hadn't been sure he was prepared to navigate. But as he thought about it, he realized there was no choice. Amelia needed stability, a sense of belonging that the shelter, despite its warmth and support, could never truly offer. And deep down, he wanted to give her that, to offer her a home where she could feel safe and valued. I think you're right," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "If she's willing, I'd like to bring her home. I want to give her a place where she knows she's not just passing through, that she belongs." Sister Margaret's face softened, a gentle smile playing at her lips. "I believe she'd like that very much, Ethan. She may not show it, but I can see how much she cares for you. I've seen the way she looks at you, the trust that's growing there. It's something rare, something that will only deepen if you give it the chance." The weight of her words settled into his heart, and he knew she was right. He wanted to be there for Amelia, to offer her the stability and protection she'd never known. But he also understood that this wasn't something he could simply decide on his own. Amelia would need to choose it, to feel ready to step into this new life with him. The next evening, Ethan found Amelia sitting in the shelter's small library, a book open in her lap, though her eyes were unfocused as she stared out the window, lost in thought. He approached her quietly, pulling up a chair beside her and waiting for her to notice him. She looked up, her expression softening slightly when she saw him. "Hey," he said gently, "do you have a minute?" She nodded, closing the book and tucking it to the side. "Sure." Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before he spoke. "Amelia, I've been thinking about everything we talked about, and about you and me. I know you've been through a lot, and I can't change what's happened in the past. But I'd like to offer you a home, a real home, where you can feel safe, where you know you belong. If that's something you want." Her eyes widened, a mix of surprise and something deeper. Hope, maybe, or disbelief, flashing across her face. You mean, like, live with you?" He nodded, his heart pounding as he searched her face for a response. "Yes, only if you want to. I won't make you do anything you're not ready for. But if you feel like this is something you want, then yes, I'd love for you to live with me." For a moment, she was silent, her expression unreadable as she processed his words. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, her eyes softening as she looked at him. I think I'd like that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I mean, I've never really had a home, not like that. But if it's with you, maybe it wouldn't be so bad." Ethan felt a rush of relief, a warmth spreading through his chest as he reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You'll have your own room," he said, trying to keep his tone light, though his voice was thick with emotion. "And you can decorate it however you want. It'll be yours." She smiled, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like excitement. I think I'd like that a lot." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over them both. Ethan knew there would be challenges, adjustments they'd both have to make as they stepped into this new life together. But he also felt a deep sense of peace, a certainty that he was doing the right thing. The following week was a flurry of activity as Ethan prepared to bring Amelia home. He worked with Sister Margaret to handle the necessary paperwork, navigating the maze of legalities that would allow him to become her guardian. Jack even pitched in, helping to secure their apartment, checking security systems, and ensuring there were no loose ends that Alejandro could exploit. Finally, the day arrived. Ethan arrived at the shelter with a sense of purpose, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nerves as he entered the building. He found Amelia waiting in the common room, her small bag packed and slung over her shoulder. She looked nervous, her gaze flitting around the room as if trying to take in every detail, every memory she was about to leave behind. "Ready?" he asked softly, holding out his hand. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding, slipping her hand into his. "Yeah, I'm ready." As they walked out of the shelter together, Amelia cast one last glance over her shoulder, her eyes lingering on the familiar walls and faces she had grown up with. But when they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, she lifted her chin, her gaze steady as she looked ahead, as if finally allowing herself to believe that she was heading towards something better. The drive to Ethan's apartment was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, he led her upstairs, unlocking the door and stepping aside to let her enter first. She walked in slowly, her eyes wide as she took in the space. It was modest but comfortable, with warm lighting and simple furnishings. A few framed photographs lined the walls, and he'd made sure to leave a small stack of books on a side table near the couch, hoping she might feel at home. "Come on," he said, guiding her down the hall. "I'll show you your room." He opened the door to a small bedroom he'd set up for her, complete with a bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the city below. He'd even added a few touches he thought she might like: a soft, woven blanket at the foot of the bed, a set of colorful fairy lights strung up along the wall, and a small desk where she could do her homework or just have a space to herself. Amelia stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took it all in. She walked over to the bed, her fingers brushing the blanket, a hesitant smile on her face as she glanced around the room. It's perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd have something like this." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he watched her, his heart swelling with gratitude and relief. "It's all yours, Amelia. And if you ever need anything, or if there's anything else you want to add, just let me know." She nodded, her eyes glistening as she looked up at him. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He smiled, stepping forward to give her a quick, gentle hug. "Welcome home, Amelia." In that moment, he knew they were both exactly where they were meant to be. For the first time in years, he felt the ache of his past begin to fade, replaced by a new purpose, a new beginning that they would build together. And as he watched Amelia settle into her new room, he knew that their story was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Amelia and Ethan began to settle into a rhythm, learning how to navigate life together. At first, there were small, awkward moments. The nervous tension when Amelia had to ask if she could have seconds at dinner, or the nights she stayed up late, as if unsure if the bed was really hers. But gradually, her cautious glances faded, replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense that she was learning to trust her new home and him. Each morning, Ethan would find her already awake, curled up on the couch with a book or studying at the small desk he'd set up for her. He'd make breakfast, and they'd sit together at the kitchen table, sharing bits of conversation about the day ahead. It was simple, but each of these small routines felt like pieces of a foundation being laid, a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Amelia began to open up more, too, asking him about his childhood, about his sister Emily. She seemed especially interested in stories about her, hanging on to every detail Ethan shared, as if she could build her own memories of a mother she'd never really known. One chilly autumn evening, they sat in the living room, wrapped in blankets as they watched a movie, the dim glow of the TV casting soft shadows around them. Partway through, Amelia turned to him, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "Ethan, do you think she would have liked me?" she asked quietly, almost as if she were afraid of the answer. Ethan paused, his heart tightening. He reached over, taking her hand gently. "Amelia, I know she would have loved you. Emily would have been so proud of the person you've become. You're kind, smart, brave. Everything she would have wanted for you." Amelia's eyes shimmered with tears, and she gave a small, grateful smile, squeezing his hand. In that moment, Ethan felt something powerful and unbreakable between them, a connection that went beyond blood or shared history. It was the beginning of a family, built on a promise to honor the memory of the sister he'd lost, and the mother Amelia never knew. As the days turned into months, Ethan also started dedicating himself to a cause he hadn't anticipated. His experience with Amelia had opened his eyes to the reality of so many children like her, those lost in a system that didn't always protect them, often forgotten by the world. Inspired by his own journey, he decided to invest part of his time and resources into creating a foundation to support at-risk youth, providing shelters and resources to help children and teens in need. He spent long hours working on the project, meeting with advocates, social workers, and former foster children who knew firsthand the struggles these kids faced. He wanted to build a place where children like Amelia could feel safe, could know that someone cared. And while the work was daunting, the purpose behind it was clear. It gave him something he hadn't had in years: direction, a renewed sense of meaning that fueled him. Amelia seemed to understand his drive and often accompanied him to meetings and planning sessions, quietly listening, observing. She even started offering her own ideas, suggestions on what the shelter should look like, or how they could make it feel like a real home for kids who had never known one. Her insights were thoughtful, compassionate, and she spoke with a quiet confidence that Ethan had come to admire deeply. One evening, as they worked together in the kitchen, Amelia glanced up at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you think maybe someday I could help, too?" she asked, her voice hesitant but hopeful. "I mean, with the shelter. I want to help kids like me, kids who need a second chance." Ethan smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "Of course, Amelia. You can be as involved as you want. In fact, I think the kids would be lucky to have you around. You know better than anyone what they're going through." She nodded, a determined glint in her eyes, and Ethan knew that. Just as he had found his purpose, so had she. Together, they would make sure no child ever felt as alone as she once had. As they settled into their new life, their days became a blend of routine and unexpected joy. They went on weekend outings to museums, explored nearby hiking trails, and spent quiet evenings playing card games and talking about their dreams. Each memory they created felt like a step toward healing, a way of building the family neither of them had realized they needed. One crisp December morning, they stood outside the newly completed shelter, a modest but welcoming building that felt warm and inviting even from the outside. The air was filled with the chatter of people, friends, and colleagues who had come to support the opening day. Ethan watched as Amelia drifted through the small crowd, her eyes bright with pride and excitement, stopping to chat with guests, sharing the story behind the shelter in her own words. Sister Margaret was there, too, beaming with pride as she saw the shelter come to life. She hugged Amelia tightly, whispering something in her ear that made the girl smile and blush, looking as though she had finally found the place she belonged. Ethan took the stage for a brief speech, his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and gratitude. He looked out over the crowd, at Amelia standing in the front row, her eyes shining with encouragement. He spoke of the journey that had led him here, of the people who had helped him along the way, and of the mission that had become his life's work. "This shelter is more than just a building," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a place of hope, a place where kids can feel safe, where they know they're not alone. And it's only the beginning. Together, we're going to build a future where every child has a chance to be seen, to be loved, and to find their way." When he stepped down, Amelia threw her arms around him, and he felt the strength of their shared bond, the unspoken promise between them to honor the memory of Emily and to build something meaningful from the ashes of their past. As they left the shelter that evening, walking hand in hand down the quiet city streets, Amelia glanced up at him, a small, contented smile on her face. "You know," she said softly, "I think I finally know what it feels like to have a family." Ethan looked down at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of joy and gratitude. "Me too, Amelia," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "Me too." In that moment, he knew that their journey, while born from tragedy and loss, had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting. Together, they had built a life out of the broken pieces of their past, transforming pain into purpose, loneliness into love. And as they walked home together, the warmth of their newfound family enveloped them, carrying them forward into a future filled with hope, resilience, and a love that could withstand anything.